At 6:10 in the morning in 1952, the street of families working in the rubber factories of Akron, Ohio, still lay beneath the glow of porch lights. The sidewalks were still damp, the kitchen windows were cold at the corners, and the school bus had not yet appeared at the end of the street. A yellow light bulb shone down on a wooden table marked with years of knife cuts. The loaf of white bread, costing about 14 to 16 cents, sat beside a glass jar of mayonnaise already more than half empty, 3 hard-boiled eggs still holding warmth, a slice of American cheese wrapped in wax paper, a ripe tomato, and a tin lunch pail dented at one corner. The mother had just washed her husband's coffee cup. The smell of soap still lingered on her hands. As she dried them on a kitchen towel, pulled the lunch pail closer, and placed 2 slices of bread on the table. The father drank black coffee by the door. The child bent down to tie a shoe. The sound of a butter knife moving across bread carried more clearly than any conversation. The tin lunch pail, the sound of a knife on bread, and the receipt box in the drawer. She opened the drawer to find the roll of wax paper. A small wooden box slid out along with several aged cards. The lid of the box was slightly warped, catching against the side of the drawer and refusing to close completely. When she lifted it, one card fell onto the table. Written in pencil were the words, "Egg salad, 2 eggs, don't use too much mayonnaise." Beneath it was a card marked bologna, mustard for father, mayo for child, a scrap of paper reminding her, August tomatoes, eat immediately, don't pack for long, a bread coupon, name labels that had once been attached to children's lunch pails. She had made those lunches long enough to know which slices of bread were softer, which fillings needed 2 layers of wrapping, and how thinly 1 egg could be mashed to cover a sandwich. She did not need a menu. She needed to know what the lunch pail was still missing. In dish number 30, an eggshell would crack against the edge of the sink. Dish number 24 carried an orange filling that had traveled to school and appeared in church basements. Dish number 20 was sliced behind a deli counter, fogged with steam for someone who had only half an hour for lunch. Dish number 15 left its smell throughout an entire break room the moment the wax paper was opened. Dish number 11 slid from a can onto a cutting board with a heavy sound. Dish number 1 required only bread, mayonnaise, and a small motion beside the sink. If old kitchens, tin lunch pails, and lunches wrapped by memory still make you want to stay a while, please follow Old American Kitchen. Each week, another card will be taken from this box. 6:14 in the morning. The sound of the school bus echoed from the end of the street. The mother placed the first egg against the edge of the sink, tapped it gently, and 30 sandwiches began with dish number 30. Eggs, cheese, tomatoes, the first lunch pail of Akron morning. In Akron in 1952, a rubber factory worker had to leave home before the street was fully awake. His wife placed a loaf of bread in the center of the table, wiped the butter knife on a towel after each filling, then steadily filled the large lunch pail with a holder for a coffee thermos and the smaller lunchbox whose latch had to be pressed twice before it would close. Dish number 30 was the egg salad sandwich. 2 eggs costing about 9 to 12 cents were cracked against the edge of the sink, peeled while the whites were still warm, then mashed in an enamel bowl. She added mayonnaise 1 small spoonful at a time, mixed in mustard, salt, pepper, and a few remaining pieces of celery. The pale yellow filling was spread all the way to the edges of the bread, cut diagonally, and wrapped in wax paper that rustled softly. For about 16 to 21 cents, the child had a complete lunch, though never knowing that the jar of mayonnaise had to last the entire week. Dish number 29 was the grilled cheese sandwich. Butter touched the skillet with a brief sizzle. 2 slices of bread and 1 slice of American cheese cost about 12 to 16 cents. She waited until the underside turned golden before flipping it, pressed lightly with a spatula, then allowed the sandwich to rest before cutting. The edges cracked crisply beneath the knife while the center still held warmth. The sandwich was eaten immediately before the father left the house, sometimes with half a bowl of tomato soup, bringing the total meal to about 23 to 28 cents. By August of 1955, the tomato sandwich appeared when the backyard tomatoes ripened all at once. She sliced the tomato directly over a plate, spread mayonnaise on both slices of bread to hold back the moisture, sprinkled on salt just before serving, then used the final piece of bread to soak up the red juices left behind. If the tomato came from the garden, the lunch cost only about 6 to 9 cents. It belonged to mornings when the kitchen was already warm and the stove had been left to cool. Dish number 27 was the peanut butter sandwich. The knife pulled the thick peanut butter from the center almost to the edges, just enough to keep the bread from becoming dry. One sandwich cost about 9 to 12 cents, kept well for hours, and could be made before the water in the kettle had time to boil again. She folded the wax paper tightly so an apple would not crush the sandwich inside the lunchbox. Dish number 26 was the bologna sandwich. A pink slice of meat was placed over mayonnaise for the child, while the father's portion received a streak of mustard. For about 14 to 19 cents, one slice of bologna, sometimes with half a slice of cheese added, was enough to make a meat sandwich for the middle of a work shift. The lunchbox lid snapped shut with a click on the second press. 6:22 in the morning. The school bus stopped at the corner. She swept the breadcrumbs into her palm, returned the egg salad card to the recipe box, and pushed the drawer closed. 2 lunches had already left the house. Her own breakfast had not yet begun. Crustless bread, cold filling, lunches no one wanted to cook over a hot stove. In the summer of 1958 in Richmond, Virginia, a table fan turned slowly on a shelf, making the edges of wax paper flutter whenever it faced the table. Mother placed a loaf of white bread on the cutting board, with a long knife resting to the right. The kitchen held only the sound of a spoon touching the side of a bowl, the twist of a jar lid against glass threads, the rhythm of a knife moving through soft bread. While reaching for a towel to dry cucumber slices, she touched the recipe box in the drawer. A cream cheese coupon slipped from between 2 cards. She picked it up, set it beside the grocery list, and continued preparing 5 lunches that needed to stay cool for many hours inside lunchboxes. Dish number 25 was the cucumber sandwich. 1 summer cucumber, bread, and a layer of softened butter or cream cheese brought the cost of each sandwich to about 10 to 15 cents. She sliced the cucumber so thin that daylight passed through the center, pressed the slices between 2 towels, and removed the crusts from the bread. The slices were arranged neatly for church meetings or lunch boxes on hot days. The crusts were saved in a small bowl. Dish number 24 was the pimento cheese sandwich. An expensive cheese was grated into a bowl and mixed with mayonnaise and drained pimento. One sandwich cost about 12 to 18 cents, but a single bowl of filling could be shared among school children, a working father, the following day's meal. The wooden spoon dragged through the orange mixture, leaving shiny streaks around the sides of the bowl. Dish number 23 was the tuna salad sandwich. A can of tuna costing about 29 to 35 cents was drained into the sink, then flaked apart with celery, mayonnaise, and pepper. Divided into 3 or 4 servings, each sandwich cost about 14 to 20 cents. She wrapped them in 2 layers of wax paper so the smell of fish would not escape until the lunchbox was opened during a break. Dish number 22 was the cream cheese and olive sandwich. Green olives left brine on the cutting board before being chopped and mixed into softened cream cheese. Costing about 16 to 24 cents, the sandwich appeared in lunchboxes and on small trays in church basements. A spoonful of olive brine made the filling easier to spread without using more cheese. Dish number 21 was the ham salad sandwich. Leftover Sunday ham was finely chopped, mixed with mayonnaise, mustard, and relish, then spread onto bread. When made from leftovers, each sandwich cost only about 12 to 18 cents. She scraped even the smallest pieces of ham from the cutting board because every piece helped the filling reach the final sandwich. The fan continued turning. In the sink sat the rinsed tuna can, the cucumber moisture still marked the towel, and the bowl of pimento cheese was covered with a small plate. She returned the ham salad card to the recipe box and noticed the card beneath it marked pastrami, rye, mustard. That card belonged to a deli counter. Out on the street, a glass door opened, a small bell rang, and a long knife came down onto the meat block. Delis, diners, factory break rooms, and hot sandwiches for people working. A shift, the pastrami, rye, mustard card in the recipe box was cleaner than the others. Beneath the hurried handwriting was a small note, "Eat at the counter. Too expensive to bring home." Behind it was another card that read, "Sunday, meat, sliced thin for Monday." The mother glanced at both, returned them to the box, and closed the drawer. The sound of a deli doorbell rang shortly afterward. New York in 1940, behind glass clouded with steam, hot pastrami rested beside rye bread and a jar of mustard. A man in a work jacket stood close to the counter, with about 25 minutes remaining before he had to return to his shift. Dish number 20, pastrami on rye, cost about 35 to 50 cents. The clerk sliced the meat thin so the lean and fat layers alternated. They spread mustard, stacked the meat on the bread, and placed it beside a cold pickle spear. Black pepper clung to the edge of the meat, steam collected on the glass. The plate was pulled away before the clerk turned to the next customer. In Worcester in 1955, dish number 19, the patty melt, rested on a diner griddle. Onions softened in fat, ground beef patty browned at the edges, and Swiss cheese melted between two buttered slices of rye bread. One sandwich cost about 45 to 65 cents. The cook pressed the sandwich against the griddle, cut it in half, then slid the plate toward a man seated at the counter. The smell of sweet onions and seared meat followed him back to his afternoon shift. Dish number 18. The roast beef sandwich began with leftover meat from a Sunday dinner in Pennsylvania in 1951. When made from meat already in the home, each sandwich cost about 20 to 30 cents. The mother trimmed away the dry edges, but sliced the remainder more thinly, spread on a little horseradish, and poured gravy into a small jar so the bread would not become soggy before lunchtime. The family supper traveled one more day inside a factory lunch pail. Number 17 was the hot dog, costing about 5 to 10 cents in New York or Chicago during the late 1930s. The Frankfurter was lifted from hot water, placed into a soft bun, topped with mustard, onions, or relish, then handed across the counter wrapped in thin paper. The customer stood beside a bus station and finished it before the steam disappeared from the bun. In Iowa in 1936, dish number 16, the crumb burger or Maid-Rite, cost about 15 to 25 cents. Ground beef was cooked loose with onions, spooned onto a bun, then topped with mustard and pickles. A few pieces of meat fell onto the paper with the first bite, but the rest was still enough to carry a worker through the second half of a shift. Knives continued striking cutting boards. Ceramic cups continued landing on counters, and coins continued changing hands. In the recipe box back in Akron, the card marked Sunday meat. Sliced thin for Monday still rested quietly, waiting for the weeks when every loaf of bread had to be divided more carefully. Sardines, dried beef, cold meatloaf, and lunches that were not allayed to be wasted Iowa, 1933. The mother lifted the loaf of bread from the table, balanced it in her palm, and counted the slices remaining before lowering the knife. The heel of the loaf was set aside for the next morning. On the shelf sat a can of sardines. In the refrigerator rested cold meatloaf, and beside the recipe box was a note that read, "Use the leftovers first." Dish number 15, the sardine sandwich, began when the can opener bit into the tin lid. Fish oil rose around the edges, and the salty smell immediately clung to the fingertips. One can costing about 10 to 15 cents was enough for 2 sandwiches, bringing each lunch down to about 8 to 12 cents. She mashed the fish with mustard, saved a little of the oil to keep the bread from becoming dry, then wrapped it tightly for the father to carry. By lunchtime, the smell of fish escaped from the paper before he could take a sip of cold coffee. Dish number 14 was creamed chipped beef on toast in Pennsylvania in 1942. Butter was heated, flour was stirred in, and milk was poured slowly until the sauce coated the spoon. Finely chopped dried beef spread its salty flavor throughout the sauce, allowing a small amount of meat to cover 2 slices of toast. Each homemade serving cost about 15 to 25 cents. If packed for the factory, the sauce was sealed tightly in a separate jar so the toast could keep its crisp edges. Dish number 13, the meatloaf sandwich, came from the previous evening's supper in Ohio in 1937. The layer of hardened fat around the edges was trimmed away, and the remaining meat was sliced just thick enough to stay intact when wrapped. At about 10 to 18 cents, the final slice went into a Monday lunch pail instead of remaining in the refrigerator. In Michigan and in 1948, dish number 12, the fried bologna sandwich, filled the kitchen with its aroma in only a few minutes. 3 small cuts kept the slice of bologna lying flat in the skillet. The edges browned, the mustard released its sharp scent, and the corner of a slice of bread was used to absorb the remaining grease. One sandwich cost about 12 to 17 cents. Dish number 11, Spam sandwich, appeared in Pennsylvania in 1945. A block of meat dropped from the can onto the cutting board was sliced into equal portions, then pan-fried until the edges darkened. One sandwich cost about 15 to 22 cents. The remaining half of the can was wrapped immediately and saved for the next day. As she put away the can opener, she touched the recipe box. A scrap of paper stained with dried jelly slipped out. Written on it in a child's handwriting were the words, "Don't cut off my crusts." She folded it again and placed it on top. Outside the window, the sound of the school bell began to ring. Peanut butter, ripe bananas, and wax paper packages opened after the school bell. The scrap of paper in the recipe box carried a dried smear of peanut butter and a child's slanted handwriting, "Don't cut off my crusts." Mother placed it beside the card marked school lunches, where 3 pencil notes read, "Peanut butter first, jelly very thin, fold paper tight to the edges." Beneath it were an old name label, a piece of ribbon, and a reminder that spotted bananas could still be mashed. The box preserved the way each child wanted to open a lunch of their own. On a morning in 1964 in Massachusetts, a school bag rested beside the door, a pair of shoes was still untied, and the bus had already picked up a child at the end of the street. On the table were white bread, peanut butter, marshmallow creme, grape jelly, a brown speckled banana, and a small cup filled with cinnamon sugar. Dish number 10, the fluffernutter, cost about 14 to 17 cents. She spread peanut butter on one slice of bread, pulled sticky white marshmallow creme across the other, and used the tip of the knife to push the filling back inside when it spread beyond the edges. By lunchtime, the filling had clung to the folds of the paper and to small fingers, but the package usually returned home empty. Dish number 9, the peanut butter and banana sandwich, cost about 16 to 21 cents. Firm bananas were sliced into rounds. Overly soft bananas were mashed on a plate and spread thinly. She kept the filling away from the edges of the bread and wrapped the sandwich in 2 layers so it could survive the bus ride. The remaining half of the banana was wrapped and saved for the following day. Dish number 8 was the peanut butter and jelly sandwich, costing about 12 to 16 cents. The peanut butter was spread first to keep the jelly from soaking too deeply into the bread. Sandwich halves were cut diagonally, placed with the cut sides facing inward, and wrapped with the paper folded tightly against the bottom of the lunchbox. By noon, the purple line had already seeped into the crumb of the bread. Dish number 7 used peanut butter and miniature marshmallows, costing about 13 to 16 cents. She arranged the candies in 2 rows, cut the larger ones in half, then pressed each corner of the bread so they would cling to the brown filling. The soft bumps beneath the bread allowed the child to recognize the sandwich from the very first bite. Dish number 6, cinnamon sugar toast sandwich, cost only about 8 to 10 cents. Butter melted over lightly toasted bread. Cinnamon sugar was sprinkled thinly across the surface, then pressed down with the back of a spoon. By lunchtime, the sugar that had fallen into the bottom of the wrapper clung to fingertips and was often eaten before the bell rang. In the school cafeteria, metal latches sprang open almost at the same moment. The jelly had soaked in, banana had softened, and the marshmallow had stuck to the paper. At home, the mother cleared the empty table. The month was nearly over, and only 6 slices of bread remained. From the recipe box, another scrap of paper slipped out. Spam. Slice very thin. Coupons, canned meat, and lunches near the end of the moo. The back of the coupon in the recipe box still carried 3 lines of pencil writing, even though most of the printed ink on the front had nearly disappeared. Spam. Slice very thin. Drain pineapple. Fish sticks, 2 for child, 3 for father. Beside it were electric bills, milk, gasoline, cough medicine, and school expenses, added together, crossed out, and totaled once again. The mother set the paper down, took the loaf of bread from the shelf, and began dividing what remained. Michigan, 1974. At the table sat an unopened bill envelope, 2 slices of American cheese stuck to their wrapper, a jar of mayonnaise with only a white ring remaining around the inside wall, and half an onion softened at one end. The freezer held an open box of fish sticks. On the shelf, a can of Spam stood beside a can of pineapple and a bag of potato chips containing only crumbs. Dish number 5, the Spam and pineapple sandwich, it cost about 25 to 35 cents. The block of canned meat fell onto the cutting board with a damp, heavy sound. She sliced it thinly, laid the pieces side by side for comparison, and cut again any slice that seemed thicker than the others. The Spam was pan-fried until the edges darkened, while the pineapple rings were drained on an enamel plate, cut in half, and quickly warmed in the remaining grease. The salty meat met the sweet tart pineapple between 2 slices of bread spread with mustard. The unused half ring was saved in a glass bowl, and the remaining meat was wrapped tightly for another meal. Dish number 4 was the fish stick sandwich, costing about 22 to 30 cents. 2 fish sticks went into the child's lunch and 3 into the father's. She arranged them apart from one another on an aluminum tray and closed the toaster oven door. The smell of warming breadcrumbs slowly spread through the kitchen as the coating turned golden and the fish inside softened. If cheese remained, she tore 1 slice into 2 pieces. The fish was allowed to rest for half a minute before being placed onto bread with ketchup or mayonnaise, but the steam would not immediately soften the coating inside the wrapper. The father received an extra fish stick because his work shift lasted longer than the school day. The Spam lid was folded down. The fish tray cooled beside the sink. The bill envelope still rested beneath the salt jar. When the coupon returned to the recipe box, a thicker card slipped from the bottom of the box. The outside was marked, "After the holiday." Inside were 3 lines. "Very little cranberry. Mayo if bread is dry. The day after the holiday, the table cleared, the turkey saved for the next lunch." The after the holiday card rested near the bottom of the recipe box, one corner stained by water, and most of the writing faded away except for a few short lines. Turkey sliced thin. Very little cranberry. Mayo if bread is dry. The final line was written smaller, tucked against the edge of the card. Save the white meat for lunch pails. The cards at the bottom of the box usually contained fewer words. The remaining steps already lived in the fingertips of the person making them. On the morning after a family gathering in Kentucky in 1967, the kitchen held a silence that had not existed the day before. The large platter rested upside down beside the sink. A faint cranberry stain remained on the tablecloth, and the last chair at the table still sat slightly pulled away. The smell of roasted turkey and old coffee lingered in the curtains, even though the guests had already gone home. The mother removed a foil-wrapped package of turkey, a bowl of cranberry sauce, a few lettuce leaves, and the loaf of bread opened the previous day from the refrigerator. Dish number 3, the turkey and cranberry sandwich, cost about 18 to 28 cents when calculated from the remaining leftovers. She separated the white meat, sliced it across the grain so the dry edges would be easier to bite through, then used the smaller slices to cover the bread completely rather than piling them into a thick mound in the center. Bread was pressed lightly with her fingertips. Any slice that had become firm received a thin layer of mayonnaise on both inner sides. The dark red cranberry sauce was spread into a narrow streak, just enough so the sweet tart flavor would not spill from the edges when the sandwich was closed. The lettuce leaves, still crisp, were dried before being placed on the turkey. The sandwich halves were cut diagonally and wrapped separately for the person who had to carry them far from home. The cold turkey had a firm grain. The mayonnaise softened the crumb of the bread, and the cranberry left a red mark on the folds of the paper. The sandwich carried traces of a house that had recently been full of people. By the following morning, it had become the lunch of someone returning to ordinary work. She wrapped the remaining turkey before preparing her own portion. The after the holiday card was returned near the bottom of the box. Only 2 cards remained beneath it. One carried a stain of dried mustard and read, "Liverwurst, rye, onion very thin." The final card was almost blank, bearing only a single line. Spread all the way to the edges so the bread won't dry out. The smell of onions in the factory break room and the last layer of mayonnaise in the jar, Pennsylvania, 1955. In a factory break room, the coffee pot had been sitting on the electric warmer since morning. Several coats hung near the door, and old water rings marked the long table. A man opened his metal lunch pail and pulled the wax paper aside. The smell of liverwurst, raw onions, and mustard spread through the room before he even lifted the sandwich. Dish number 2, the liverwurst sandwich, cost about 15 to 25 cents. At home, Mother removed the soft meat from its wrapper, spread it directly onto rye bread, then drew a thin layer of mustard across the top. The onion was sliced nearly transparent, with only a few rings placed between the bread so the smell would not overwhelm the meat. If pickles remained, she added 2 small slices before wrapping the sandwich in 2 layers of wax paper. Liverwurst was soft and rich, its rye carried a mild sourness, and the onion was crisp and sharp. The sandwich was familiar in many German and Eastern European families, where organ meats were treated as an ordinary part of a meal. During the break, one man looked up because of the onion smell while another continued drinking his coffee. The worker took his first bite the same way he had for many years. Dish number 1 brought the story back to Ohio in 1952. 2 slices of bread and the last mayonnaise scraped from the jar became a plain mayonnaise sandwich costing about 6 to 7 cents. The mother tilted the jar toward the light bulb, traded the spoon for a longer butter knife, and scraped closely around the inside walls of the glass. The white mayonnaise was divided between 2 slices of bread and spread all the way to the edges so the crumb would not become too dry. A few specks of pepper were added if the pepper shaker was still on the table. She placed the slices together, pressed them gently, cut the sandwich in half, and folded the paper around it. The lunch pail lid closed with a lighter sound than usual. Inside, there was almost none of the weight of meat, cheese, or eggs, yet a lunch had still been prepared before someone left the house. One sandwich carried the smell of onions throughout the break room. The other held only the scent of bread and mayonnaise. Both began at the same table with the same knife during the same few minutes of the morning. Mother placed the final card at the bottom of the recipe box. The wooden lid lowered, leaving one small corner of paper exposed. The lunch pail washed clean, and the recipe box closed. At the end of the day in Akron, Ohio, 1952, the tin lunch pail was set down beside the sink. The latch on the left still had to be pressed twice before it would open. Inside remained a few breadcrumbs, a folded piece of wax paper, a streak of dried mayonnaise, and the stem from a small apple. The morning had passed through many traces like these: eggshells cracked against the edge of the sink, cheese softened between golden slices of bread, juice from August tomatoes remained on the plate. Cucumbers were pressed dry in a towel, red pimento floated through a bowl of orange filling, and a can of tuna was scraped into the corners before the sandwich was wrapped in 2 layers. Behind the deli counter, pastrami fell into slices beneath a long knife. On the diner griddle, onions softened beside a beef patty. In Iowa, sardine oil glistened around the rim of a can. Milk gravy thickened beneath a spoon, and the meatloaf from the previous evening was saved for the next morning. Peanut butter clung to the folds of paper, brown speckled bananas were mashed, and cinnamon sugar remained at the bottom of a wrapper. Pineapple was drained, fish sticks were allowed to rest before wrapping, holiday turkey was sliced across the grain, and the final layer of mayonnaise was scraped from the sides of the jar. Those lunches depended on small calculations. The person preparing them knew which slice of meat had to be cut thinner, which filling was likely to leak, which portion belonged to a long work shift, and what needed to be saved for the next day. She did not need a menu. She only needed to know what the lunch pail was still sig. Lunch wrapped before dawn was one way of thinking about another person's hunger many hours before it arrived. The mother pulled out the wax paper, brushed away the crumbs, and turned on the warm water. Fingers moved along the folded seams of the lunch pail, where crumbs often became trapped. The butter knife was washed clean and placed into a cup near the table. The final card returned to the recipe box beside egg salad, bologna, spotted bananas can still be used, and turkey, cranberry, bread. The lunch pail rested upside down on a towel. A drop of water ran from one metal corner. The recipe box sat in a drawer that had not been pushed fully closed, its wooden lid still leaving one corner of a card exposed. If one of the sandwiches in this story ever appeared in your family's lunch pail, leave the name of that sandwich in the comments. Someone else may be searching for that same flavor. Please follow Old American Kitchen so that the next time the recipe box is opened, that you will still have a place at the old kitchen table. The kitchen light went out. Some recipes never needed to be written down completely because the hands standing beside the table every morning had remembered the rest for a very long time.